We are just into March, and I'm taking advantage of the warm March weather that we're having to inspect the hives out in the country. I'm at a location where I have 2 hives right now. I did have 3, but 1 absconded last fall. And this is the first time I've been on this site since, I believe, the 1st or 2nd of October last year. So it's been a while since I've checked these hives out. Now, as I come up on this first hive, the entrance looks great. I see lots of traffic there. I had to open the entrance from the winter setting instead of the little gap that I left for winter, but the traffic in and out looked pretty good. So let's open it up and see what the bees look like. Last year I changed all of my hives to use insulated lids. I went ahead and put this 3/4 inch piece of styrofoam basically on top of the frames to help keep heat in, but it's probably unnecessary, and it's only 3/4 inch because that's all the space there is between the frames and the underside of the insulated lid. I had several frames that I left in here when I consolidated the space in the main hive. I just left some honey in there on this end. So far it looks like a pretty good, well, I'll say a moderate quantity of bees in here, which I wouldn't expect them to be super populated this time of year. This first frame is what would have just been stored as a honey frame. Still fairly heavy. Has some pollen in there and some honey at the top, some nectar down here along with the pollen. I don't know if that nectar is new or not. It's possible something is blooming out there and they're gathering some nectar, but quite a bit of wet nectar. And as I get to this next frame, I can see these bees are getting ready to boost up their population. As you look at that frame, you can see that the middle of that frame is almost all completely capped brood. There's some larvae in there that's not yet capped. They got some pollen at the top, a little nectar at the top, and those cells, I was saying earlier about the cells that were open, these cells probably were chewed open. That would have been capped honey as of the end of last year. And you can see here they've got a nice round section of capped brood on there. Let me see if I can see any eggs in there. Oh, I see lots of young larvae and some eggs. So yeah, so they're getting ready for their population to take off. A good section of capped brood with this little section cut out. And I do see some larvae in there. It's possible that was laid earlier and has already emerged. Now the queen may be going back and laying in there again. It's pretty typical to see sort of a bullseye pattern in the brood as the queen lays from the center and works her way out. Then when those center bees emerge, then it leaves a hollow space in the middle, so to speak, or empty cells in the middle. Then the queen has to work her way back. Now this frame, interesting, this is closer to the entrance, but it has less capped brood, and possibly that's because a lot of the cells are larger. They're more drone brood sized, so maybe the bees haven't cleaned those for the queen to lay in so they can produce more workers. This frame has very little capped brood on this side towards me, and that's because a lot of those cells are filled up with pollen. On this side there is a little patch of capped brood right there, but there's a lot of pollen stored up here as well. And there is my queen right there. I had given her a red dot last year. It looks like that is pretty much gone by now. They've cleaned her off, it seems. And this final frame is typical. Usually with the end frame is mainly, you see some capped honey on there up here, and it's mainly the same on the other side. Honey and nectar on there. Good brood, getting built up for spring here. I don't think I saw a single drone cell in there, so they don't seem to be thinking about preparing for swarming yet. They've still got pretty good stores, and we are starting to see some flowers popping up here, so they look like they're in good shape for nectar. I will probably, considering that their population is about to go through a sudden boost, I think I may add one more of those frames that has honey on it into this main section of the hive, so they have a little bit of expansion space there. And actually I want to work to kind of cycle some of these frames out, some of these older darker comb frames. So I'm going to make a gap here and put that lighter comb, one of these frames with the lighter comb, closer to the entrance. Gradually I'll move the older comb farther away from the entrance, farther away from the brood section, and then eventually we'll just harvest those as honey frames. This one has good cell size. Had some drone size cells, but I think that's okay. We'll go with that. That leaves them with 7 frames. That looks pretty good. And I'm happy about where this hive is right now. Looking really good for spring. So now let's go check on the other hive. On this hive, just like the other one, it seems like they have good traffic at the entrance. Going to have to open up that entrance more for them now that the weather's warmer. Otherwise, this is a good indication about how the colony's doing. Now let's look inside. Similar to the other hive, I have some frames here on the open end of the hive, just kind of storing them here. Now, a couple of these are frames that were victims of comb collapse, and there's not really much in them. I don't remember if there was anything in them when I put them over here, and I just have some frames after that of foundation. They're not really doing anything with those, which is what I would expect. They're not there really for them to use. Now I do have one other extra frame here that is just on the other side of the divider board, and it's pretty much an empty frame as well. My little spacer bar here. And I just have these bars in here just to put up against the divider board to kind of help keep it in place, which I don't remember for sure, but that's probably why I put the other frame there, was just to give a little more weight to keep that divider board in place. Once the bees propolize it, it's not really going to go anywhere, but until then I don't want it to tip over for any reason. So this first frame looks like it's getting a little empty. Yeah, there's not a whole lot in this one. There's a few cells of nectar, but it's pretty well cleaned out. Now I feel some weight, so there's probably, and yeah, as I was expecting, there's more wet nectar throughout that frame. And this frame being on the end, this was probably almost all honey going into the fall. So this nectar that's exposed, it may be that honey. They use that going into spring as they're starting to rear new brood. Now this hive had 7 frames through winter. The other hive that we just looked at had 6 going through winter. So this one must have been a little stronger starting out. So this one's more nectar and pollen throughout that frame. And more nectar on that back side. Haven't seen brood yet in this one like we did in the other, but they had an extra frame, so it may be farther in. That other hive had most of their brood a couple frames away from the entrance, which was interesting. Usually they start right by the entrance. And I'm seeing some capped brood here now. I'll get to that one. This is another frame. We got some pollen on this side. Can't tell, there might be some larvae. Yeah, I see eggs down in here. So throughout these cells right here, we've got some eggs. I'm not going to keep this out very long because I don't want those to get chilled. That band of honey that was at the top of the frame, you can see the bees are opening that. And there's still quite a bit of nectar in there, but they've uncapped those cells and are using that honey. If you watch my smoker, you can tell how the wind is blowing in because it's blowing air in the top and blowing the smoke out the bottom. Oh man, looking good in here. So here we got more capped brood. And this one, you can kind of see this bullseye. They got the capped brood here, and cells through here. I can see that there's larvae down in there, very young larvae. So again, these cells were probably laid first. There's a few that are still capped in there. Maybe they just got laid later, but a lot of these have probably emerged once, and now the queen has laid in those again. And this side is pretty close to a mirror image of what we were seeing there. It's a nice population of bees in here now, especially that I'm getting back towards the entrance. Well, not as many on this side, but still. Got good capped brood there. And on the other side, got capped brood covering pretty much the top, 2/3 of the frame. Now we do have some drone brood in here. Haven't spotted my queen yet, but that's okay. She's clearly in here working. But got some drone brood up here at the top. Not much. And again, we got kind of that bullseye pattern with a little cap brood at the top and a gap and then some more cap brood. And quite a bit of young larvae down through the bottom there. So they are building up. And this one is a little more textbook than the last hive in that their brood is back towards the entrance. They're letting me know that I'm not really welcome here. So we'll be quick. Oh, she got me. See if I can scrape her. Oh, she lost it. Okay. Didn't scrape the stinger out fast enough to save her. So I haven't seen the queen yet. Got some pollen and some nectar stored up in here. And a lot more pollen on this other side. A lot of pollen stored up in that side. Maybe a little hard to see on camera there. But otherwise, they're looking pretty good. I think they've got enough open cells. I'm not going to expand their space yet. Overall, I am extremely happy with how these two hives are doing. Now, the first hive we looked at, they had tons of resources left. This last one doesn't have as much left, but I do believe they have plenty to get them through the rest of March and into spring as things start blooming. So I'm not worried about them. And these were two strong hives going into winter, so I'm not too surprised at how well they're doing now. I do have 3 more hives to check at a different location, and those hives are a little weaker going into winter, so I'm interested to see how they're doing now. These are the ones going into winter I had the least confidence in. As I get here and start looking at the hives, I'm seeing some things that encourage me and some things that are not so encouraging. So I'll give you a quick look at the hive entrances, tell you what I think we might find inside, and then we'll get inside and see what's really going on. So this first hive, and I'm not even sure what we'd call it, maybe the love and butterflies hive, but the entrance causes me some concern. If you see all the dirt underneath that entrance, that to me looks like they have been robbed out. And this queen that was in this hive was an old queen. She had a white dot. I showed her in a few other videos. Basically, moving her out here, I was kind of putting her out to pasture. The bees had tried to replace her a couple times and it just never worked out. So I was a little concerned that they may not get through winter. It looks like that might be the case. I see the bee buzzing around there going in. I don't know if that means they have any colony left, but we'll open them up and see what's inside. But first we're going to look at the other hives. The second hive is looking much better than the first one we looked at. As we look at the entrance, you can see it doesn't have all that dirt underneath. We also see a lot of good traffic at the entrance. I see a lot of bees going in there with pollen. So I think we've probably got a good colony that has gotten through winter here. So we'll open them up in a little bit and see what's going on with them. The third hive, and the one which I believe was the strongest going into winter, also seems to have good traffic at the entrance. I don't see any of that mess that could be an indication of robbing. Instead, I just see good traffic here at the entrance, bees going in and out. Like the last one, I think this one looks like they're probably doing pretty well. This will be the first one that will open up and look inside. Because these colonies were fairly weak last fall, I did feed these hives, and then I never really made it back out to do a final pre-winter check on them. So that's why the entrances were wide open, and it seems like it didn't hurt them too much. But that's also why they still have a frame feeder in there. There is some frass here on top. I don't know if that's wax moth or hive beetle. They tend to, on these frames, they tend to try to get down through those holes where the wire is run. Well, this first frame is honey, and they still have good stores there. And wow, they got brood on the next one. So they're good honey still stored up in there. And the brood in these is really good news because they were just slow to produce and build up brood. So you can see all that cap brood. There's lots of larvae around that. Got some pollen at the top. If you can see that yellow pollen at the top. It's still got a pretty decent band of honey at the top. so that's really nice. And all the way down to those cells, right down at the very edge, they've got eggs in those cells. And this hive did overwinter on just 6 frames because they were fairly weak. I want to show you if you can see the pollen in that frame, all yellow and orange pollen, kind of packing it up. Again, they've got some capped brood there. It's like one cell that's either only partially capped or they're starting to uncap, but the rest of it looks pretty good. And I've got kind of that bullseye pattern. It looks like probably bees have emerged out and they have started another batch of brood in there, because they do have young larvae in those. The queen could be on any of these frames. I'm trying to keep an eye out for her. The other side, like that other one I showed you, has lots of pollen at the top there. We've got another frame of pretty good brood there. A little bit spotty. I'm not too concerned about that. Sometimes that spotty brood can be a little bit of indicator of hygienic behavior, but in this case it looks like it's a mix of cells where they've stored up pollen intermingled with the brood. The next frame doesn't have as much brood, but they got a bunch of pollen. There is some larvae in there, so it's just not as much cap brood. But just a little patch of cap brood at the top there, some larvae around it, but it's pretty much surrounded by pollen. There are, in the very middle, there's several cells with eggs, so we've got brood in all stages throughout here. And this final frame, I would not expect to see much larvae in it. The end frame is typically just resources, honey and pollen. And in this hive, I'm expecting I'll probably see a bunch of pollen. And I see my queen in here. She's actually sticking her head down in those nectar cells. Now she's kind of moving down here. She's right in there. Good to see her active in there. Good to see the bees building up brood. Because a lot of these frames are partial, I don't think I really need to add any space yet. They've got some space to build. So I think I'll close them up and move on to the next hive. Now we're looking at the space themed hive. And this one, like the other, had good traffic at the entrance. Like the other, I fed this hive last fall. They did have a smaller number of frames. This hive overwintered on 5 rather than the 6 that we just saw in the other hive. But based on the traffic at the front, it looks like they did pretty well through winter. So we'll see what they look like. This first frame, which would have been a honey frame, still has some honey at the top and just a few bees on it. Oh, and they got more honey in the middle on the other side. I don't see any larvae in this one. Got pretty good honey throughout there. A little less on this side. They've used up some of that. Next frame has some honey at the top. Not seeing any capped brood yet. We'll look to see if there's any open brood here. Any larvae or eggs. They have a bunch of pollen in this side. Must be plenty of pollen resources already available this year. I'll show you that in just a second. We had a little pollen on this side as well. So got some honey at the top and some pollen down through there. But on this side, pretty much this whole top section is packed with pollen. And now I see a little bit of brood here. Still a little honey at the top. Probably not bringing in a lot of nectar yet. A little more honey at the top on this side. So we've got kind of that bullseye pattern with the brood. So we've got cap brood in the middle, got larvae around there. It has probably gone through at least one cycle of emerging brood, and now we're into the second cycle or maybe more. We got some larvae throughout there, and then more larvae around the outside, and then some pollen here. Not a real big brood area yet, and kind of a similar bullseye situation on the other side. This one has some more brood, still kind of a small brood area, not taking up the whole frame, but they got nectar across the top there, honey across the top, and then some pollen under that, and then their brood area through here. It's kind of surrounded by pollen. They've got open brood through here, larvae. I do see some eggs down in there. This side has the remnants of some old queen cells on it, but those are from last year. I marked on the top of this frame, that was April of last year, that this frame had those queen cells. And that brings us to the final frame, which, as I recall correctly, we found the queen on the last frame in the other hive. There's not a lot in this frame. They got tons of pollen stored up though. I don't know if you can see all this yellow and orange pollen through here. And lots of bees carrying pollen there and there and there and there and there. Over here, they are just packing that in. But I'm not going to spend too much time trying to find the queen. Their population in this hive, I would just call it moderate. Hopefully that queen will kind of ramp it up because those brood sections are fairly small right now. But we'll probably see that, those brood areas expanding as the nectar flow kind of kicks in. Since they're not fully filling up these frames yet, and because they only have a moderate population in here, I'm not going to add any additional frames. I don't want to give them more space than they can defend against hive beetles or wax moths, and they still have plenty of cells to fill on here. I'll come back as we start to get in the nectar flow and give them more frames then. So the 5 of Hearts colony is doing pretty well, moderately well. They're building. Now I'm on to this colony that appears to have been robbed out, and I'll be surprised if I find any signs of life of the colony in here. Based on the traffic at the entrance, it looks like there might be a few scattered bees, but I'm not expecting much good news. Like I said, this was an old queen. She was slowing down last year. It would have been a miracle if this colony had come out of winter doing well, but because they weren't able to successfully replace their queen, I figured I'd just let her go finish out the season. So yeah, they've definitely been robbed out. This wax is chewed. Any honey that was in there is gone. Got some old comb that'll be useful for swarm traps here, so that's a plus side. To be honest, this isn't as gross as I was expecting. I was afraid this was going to be just completely overrun with wax moths, and it really isn't. This frame, a little patch of old brood, obviously dead. There's actually some frames on the far end that still have some honey. Don't know why those didn't get robbed out. Not a lot of dead bees in here either. I think that the colony kind of just died out of attrition. Low population, the queen really didn't build up any winter bees in the fall, and they were done for. So no surprise here based on what I saw at the entrance. Nothing really to do here but take these frames home. I'll use those for swarm traps, leave this hive for a new colony this year. These results were about what I expected from these hives based on how they looked in the fall. Now, the first one we looked at surprised me with how well they were building up, but that made the mediocre showing of the second hive a little disappointing. And the third hive, like I said, I would have been surprised if they made it through winter. I was able to get the comb out. It hadn't been torn up by wax moths or anything, so I'd be able to make good use of that comb that's left behind. I do believe that's the only colony that I have lost through this winter. Now, we're not really into the nectar flow yet, but overall I'm happy with how my hives are looking in total. I hope you're finding your hives looking good coming out of winter as well. Let us know in the comments how your hives are doing. If you like this video, you might also like this one that YouTube has selected just for you. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.